100 years on, one of the bloodiest battles of the First World War is remembered. Here on the battlefields of the Somme, 1 million men were killed or injured. Soldiers of today with the reflections of soldiers of the time and the horror of the battle.
The whole earth trembled. You could feel the vibrations coming up through the earth, through your limbs, through your body.
Politicians and royalty join the commemorations here, and falling poppies to symbolise the huge number of lives lost. I'm in the Somme this lunchtime on a special day of commemoration both here and across the UK.
Also this lunchtime, Gove calls himself the candidate for change and questions May's determination to leave the EU. And Wales carry British hopes for a place in Euro 2016's semi-finals.
This is the ITV Lunchtime News with Mark Austin in northern France and Alistair Stewart in the studio.
Good afternoon from Thiepval in northern France, where 100 years ago today on these battlefields, 20,000 British soldiers were killed in the space of just 24 hours. It was the first day of what became known as the Battle of the Somme, one of the deadliest of the First World War. Over the following months, more than 1 million men from both sides were killed or injured. Today, those who fought here were remembered and commemorated by the military, by royalty and by relatives. It was a moving and poignant morning, as Tim Ewart now reports.
As they gathered for today's ceremony, as the French President and the British Prime Minister shared a private moment, what happened here 100 years ago seemed to put current European events into sharp perspective. There were 1 million casualties at the Battle of the Somme, dead and injured. The monument at Thiepval commemorates more than 72,000 men who died and have no known grave.
Treason! Ah!
They played the British national anthem and the Marseillaise of France. And the formal start of the commemorations was marked by a gun salute.
Stand by! Fire!
It was as nothing compared to the fearsome barrage 100 years ago, remembered in a reading of the words of a soldier who was there.
The whole earth trembled. You could feel the vibrations coming up through the earth, through your limbs, through your body.
Keep the home fires burning. It was a popular song with the young British volunteers, reflecting a sense of optimism despite the miseries of war.
There's a silver lining.
But there was no silver lining here. Allied dead on the first day of the battle, 19,240. The accounts of those who were there haunted the ceremony in their honour. Former England footballer Sol Campbell read the words of a footballer from a century ago.
Willie turned to me and said, "Goodbye, Mac. Best of luck. Special love to my sweetheart, Mary Jane, and the best regards to the lads at the Orient."
And the Prince of Wales read from the poet John Masefield.
All wars end. Even this war will someday end. And the ruins will be rebuilt, and the field full of death will grow food. And all this frontier of trouble will be forgotten.
But not forgotten today, as the poppies fell, as children lined the graves, and as wreaths were laid, the dead of the Somme were honoured and remembered. Tim Ewart, ITV News.
Well, it was not just here that the men who died are being remembered today. Right across Britain there have been services up and down the country. At Westminster Abbey, an overnight vigil was held at the tomb of the unknown soldier. The King's Troop Royal Horse Artillery firing First World War guns in Parliament Square to mark its end. Veterans gathered at Edinburgh Castle to pay tribute and hold a 1-minute silence. In Belfast, members of the Irish Guards lowered their guns to commemorate those that lost their lives. While in Cardiff, whistles pierced the air, the sound that a century ago directed soldiers over the top. Well, I'm joined now by Clive Adlam, who at the ceremony a little earlier read the words of his father Tom, a lieutenant, a second lieutenant from the Bedfordshire Regiment. He won a Victoria Cross for his bravery here, the highest and most prestigious award a soldier can earn. Clive, welcome. And one of 49 Victoria Crosses given for the Battle of the Somme. Yeah. Just tell us, what did he do?
Well, first of all, he won the Victoria Cross for what he did over 2 days. The first day, there'd already been 7 attempts to get into the trenches in front of Thiepval. He took part in the 8th attempt, and it was beaten back the same as all the others had been before. Everybody dived to cover after the assault. He had a small band of men. He was a bombing officer. He had a small band of men with him, and he decided he was going to get in that trench even if the rest of them had failed. And he did. He led his men forward. They threw their bombs in front of them, and they got into the enemy trench. He then threw bombs along the trench, ran out of bombs, discovered the Germans had left a whole lot of their bombs behind them. He learnt quickly how to use them, started throwing the Germans' own bombs at them, which must have surprised them, but to find their own bombs coming at them. But he carried on and, in fact, cleared the whole trench. The whole battalion was supposed to. Quite
extraordinary story. I think we've got we can hear a recording made by your father, I think sometime in the 70s. Let's just have a listen, if we can, to him.
When the bombings, the shells started, you'd never think anything could have lived at all in the bombing that went on to Somme Redoubt. And we started charging up the trench, my old men coming on behind very gallantly, and we got right to within striking distance of Somme Redoubt itself, you see. And just at that minute, I got a bang in my arm and found I was bleeding.
Well, there we are, Clive. You must have real pride at what your father did. Is there any anger at all at the way they were, in a sense, led to their slaughter?
My father certainly didn't have any anger. He thought the same as many of them thought, that it was a war to end all wars. Unfortunately, as we all know, it wasn't. And the war that followed was perhaps even more catastrophic than the First World War.
And just very briefly, what does all this mean to you?
It does mean a lot to me to think that those poor chaps who went out there thinking at the Somme they were going to just walk across to meet practically no opposition, then to be mown down in the thousands, not hundreds, thousands. It's nice to know that they are remembered and that perhaps everything wasn't for nothing.
Right. OK, Clive, thank you very much for joining us. Well done this morning. Thank you very much indeed. And much of our knowledge about what happened in these fields around me here comes from the diaries and letters sent home by those who took part in the fighting. Many families have kept their correspondence, and a century on they've become an essential record of battle. They've been passed down through generations, and I've been speaking to one 16-year-old who has been reading the testimony of his grandfather.
There's quite a big emphasis on his involvement in the First World War, particularly the Somme.
Reading these diaries and reminiscences has had a profound impact on 16-year-old Daniel Davison. This is his grandfather, Dudley Lissenberg, a gunner in the Royal Artillery, whose writings describe with great poignancy the eve of battle and what followed.
Where the infantrymen were sitting on the duck-boarded floor with outstretched legs. Some were writing letters, perhaps their last, home. Others were conversing in subdued tones, and some were making a brave attempt at ribaldry. The anxiety, though brave attempts were made to hide it, was clearly discernible in the faces of those seated in silent contemplation of the morrow, and the pathos of it all overwhelmed me. And I found it hard to disguise my emotions as I stepped over their outstretched legs and acknowledged their smiles. I watched with mixed feelings the lads mount the fire step and, when at 0730 hours the barrage lifted, spring up the ladders onto the parapet, many sliding back immediately. They had reached the top, killed or wounded. Coolly, it seemed, the survivors worked their way through our barbed wire in face of fierce shell and machine gun fire, leaving many of their pals on the wire dead. Now, what were my sensations as I watched these brave young lads go forward unflinchingly to their doom? Predominantly, an exalted feeling of pride at being British, and pathos when realising that so many of them had sacrificed their young lives in vain. The fact that firsthand I know what happened through his words, I feel a huge connection to someone who I see as a hero.
One family among many acknowledging the sacrifice and their gratitude 100 years on.
Well, our senior international correspondent, John Irvine, joins me now. So, John, apart from the obvious, the scale of the deaths and the horror of what happened here, why does this resonate so strongly, do you think?
I think it is all about the men, their unflinching nobility in these battlefields and who they were, Mark. We know from watching TV series like Sharp that the British Army of the 19th century was made up of aristocrats in the officer corps and hard working class men in the ranks. Well, Kitchener's army was very different. It was an army raised in 1914, 1915 in Britain and Ireland. It was an army of every man, butcher, baker, candlestick maker, engineer, doctor, you name it. They were all, you know, they all signed up to do their bit. And I think there are a lot of us in the country who know that were 1916 our time on earth, well, it would have been us.
All right, John, thank you very much indeed. And that is it from here this lunchtime. Safe to say, Alistair, that just to be here in these fields with these people, in these cemeteries on this day has, well, it's been a real privilege. Back to you.
Remarkable events, remarkable people. Mark, thank you. Well, here, Michael Gove launched his campaign to lead the Conservatives and become the next Prime Minister, saying he was the candidate for change. The Justice Secretary said the next PM must be utterly committed to taking the UK out of the EU, and he questioned Theresa May's track record on Brexit. But he faced close questioning himself on his role in what is being called the political assassination of Boris Johnson. Meanwhile, Chancellor George Osborne abandoned his ambition to achieve a budget surplus by 2020. He blamed the decision to leave the EU. Here's our Deputy Political Editor, Chris Shipp.
He should have been on the first full day of his leadership campaign.
What have you done for this country? Seems to be all right to me. What? Seems to be all right to me.
Instead, Boris Johnson walked out of his house this morning and straight into someone who gave him verbal abuse.
Absolute disgrace. Rubbish. You don't have the guts to sort it out. Rubbish.
It is safe to say these have not been the best 2 days of Boris's political life.
Did you betray Boris?
The man who brutally executed Mr. Johnson's downfall yesterday launched his own leadership bid today, even though he'd said more than once it was not a job for him. So the task in hand here this morning was to address what Michael Gove did and why.
I came to realise this week that for all Boris's formidable talents, he was not the right person for that task. I had to stand up for my convictions. I had to stand up for a different course for this country. I had to stand for the leadership of this party.
He promised to be a Prime Minister who, on immigration, would bring numbers down. And as for that contentious claim, the £350 million a week could be spent on the NHS, Mr. Gove promised more money, but much less.
That's why I will take all the steps necessary to give the NHS at least another £100 million per year, another £100 million per week by 2020.
There was not what you'd call a crowd of Tory MPs backing him here, suggesting his move against Boris has turned many against him, but he does have one very senior supporter.
There's no way in the world now that Michael Gove is the man to do that.
Well, I think you're right to say that actually the party, what we've seen in the course of the last week is a very divided nation, which I've also been talking about this week, and of course a divided Conservative party. The party wants to get back on track with delivering the manifesto. And actually I'm somebody who was campaigning on a different side of the argument from Michael, and I think it's important that we now, and I now, support somebody who's on a different side.
Meanwhile, the Chancellor, remember him, announced this morning his pledge to balance the books by 2020 was being thrown in the bin after the vote to leave the EU. It was, said one of the other leadership contenders, a convenient excuse.
The abandonment of our fiscal targets, I wouldn't say had nothing to do with Brexit. I'd said Brexit gave it a very good excuse to abandon targets that might have had to be abandoned anyway.
It's one reason why Michael Gove says the next Prime Minister should be someone who campaigned to leave the EU, and he wants that Prime Minister to be him.
And Chris Boyd joins me live from Westminster now, just half a step back, as it were. How significant in reality is that from the Chancellor to scrap the pledge of reaching a budget surplus?
Well, Alistair, I'd say this. You don't have to look too hard to find people who thought the ambition to balance the books by 2019 and have a surplus of £10 billion by 2020 was a little bit ambitious after all those years of being in the red. But we've now had that from the Chancellor. Yesterday, Theresa May, when she launched her leadership bid, says it should slide as well. I asked Michael Gove about it today. He thought it was a sensible plan. Now, that balancing of the books was based on tax rises going up, more spending cuts, but also a certain level of growth in the economy. Now, you could therefore argue that all of these leadership contenders are admitting that they think the economy will be hit since our decision to leave the EU. Now, you heard Liam Fox at the end there say he thinks it was a convenient excuse, but I think it does say something about the uncertain period we're going into economically, that this target has now been put in the bin.
Chris, thank you. Well, meanwhile, for Labour, it was leadership challenge deferred again. The Shadow Chancellor has said that Jeremy Corbyn is likely to face a challenge in the next few days, but believes that he will survive it. John McDonnell urged MPs to calm down. Our political correspondent, Romilly Weeks, was watching all of that in central London. Are they likely, Romilly, to calm down?
Not a chance, I'd say. Mr McDonnell's speech here today on the economy was supposed to be a sign that Labour's getting on with business as normal, but of course it's anything but. The Labour Party seems to have gone from turmoil to a state of paralysis. We had been expecting a leadership challenge from Angela Eagle. That appears to have been postponed. I understand because they are still hoping that Mr Corbyn might be persuaded to go willingly. But having listened to Mr McDonnell today, of course, one of Jeremy Corbyn's closest allies, I'd say there's very little chance of that.
Jeremy's the leader of the Labour Party, he's staying leader of the Labour Party, and if there is a challenge, there'll be a democratic election. Jeremy will stand, he's automatically on the ballot paper under our rules, he'll stand. I think he'll win, but you can never predict these things, it's a democratic election.
I've also been speaking to senior sources in the Mr Corbyn must go camp. They describe the situation in the Labour Party now as genuinely farcical and say that members of the shadow cabinet are unable to meet or even speak with Mr Corbyn because those surrounding him are worried that he might be susceptible to persuasion, to getting him to resign. Of course, those supporters of him point always to his huge mandate from the Labour membership. 60,000 new members have signed up in the past week alone, but it is far from clear whether they've signed up to support him or to help depose him.
Romilly, thank you. In other news this lunchtime, scientists say the hole in the ozone layer over Antarctica appears to be getting smaller. They celebrated it, saying the changes can be attributed to the 1987 ban on some chemicals used in refrigerators and aerosol cans being banned. They predict that the hole could permanently close by the middle of the century, which may help reduce harm from the sun to both humans and animals. Ryan Giggs is ending his 29-year career at Manchester United. Over almost 3 decades, Giggs made a record 903 appearances for the club and was at the heart of United's success under Sir Alex Ferguson. And finally, thousands of Wales fans have arrived in France, ready to support the last remaining home nation in the Euros. The Welsh side take on Belgium in Lille tonight. If they win, it'll be the first time that they've reached a semi-final of a major tournament in their history. Our sports editor Steve Scott is live in Lille for us this lunchtime. Steve, pretty exciting stuff.
Absolutely, Alistair, and I think Wales have got plenty to be confident about. If you think about it, in this tournament so far, apart from that unlucky last-minute loss to England, they've won every single game. I suspect their fans will be outnumbered tonight. Of course, where we are in Lille is just across the border from Belgium, and we've seen tens of thousands of Belgian fans flooding across the border this morning. Officially, Wales have 7,000 tickets, Belgium have 10,000. I don't expect what we see in the stadium later to reflect that by any means at all. Having said that, despite being outnumbered, the Wales fans we spoke to this morning are all quietly confident.
We've been away for 3 weeks and we don't want to go home, but we're just living the dream, aren't we, darling?
It's the stuff that dreams are made of, and I honestly believe that we have realistic chances.
We've never qualified for anything, never mind reached the quarter-final. Incredible.
Well, some good news for Wales ahead of tonight's game. Belgium have lost their 2 best defenders. I suspect Gareth Bale will be licking his lips about that. And then recent history, well, the last 3 times they've played, Wales have not lost. In fact, the last time they played when qualifying for this tournament, they won in Cardiff, 1-0, Gareth Bale the scorer.
We'll have some more of that. Steve, thank you very much indeed. And that is it this lunchtime. Mark will be here again with the latest on those remarkable scenes at the Somme. Charlene White will be here too in the studio for the ITV Evening News. From all of us for now, though, bye-bye.